Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Albright from NAAEE. A couple of quick notes before we jump in with today's guests. This episode was recorded at the NAAEE conference in the fall of 2024. And I want to take a moment to share a little bit about us. For over 50 years, the North American Association for Environmental Education has cultivated a strong network of environmental educators who are helping people of all ages to develop the knowledge and skills to protect our planet, to tackle complex challenges, and to think critically about the issues shaping the world for generations to come. The future of EE is in your hands. Please visit NAAEE.org/donate to find out how you can contribute to our mission of advancing EE around the world. And thank you for being part of the world we want.
Welcome to The World We Want, the NAAEE podcast. You know, film is a uniquely powerful medium for communicating, especially the significance of environmental education. Visual storytelling captures the imagination. It evokes emotion and can bridge the gap between abstract ecological concepts and their real-world consequences. Hi, I'm your host, Jerry Ellis. And with over 3 decades of global conservation filmmaking experience, I have witnessed firsthand how film and environmental education can form a powerful, influencing duo. In today's episode, we ask the question, can environmental education through the camera's unflinching lens help us bridge divides between rural and urban communities, across beliefs and perspectives, and even help us find a sense of place in a heavily digitized world? To help answer that question, I'm joined by filmmakers James Parker and Juliet Grable of Synchronous Pictures. They are the creative force behind the 2020 documentary Other Side of the Hill, a film exploring the effects of climate change in rural Western America. This episode, we dive into their newest project, In Our Nature. From Chicago's South Side to the hills of Kentucky and to families in San Antonio, James and Juliet and their team have been bringing to life stories that show how nature-based learning can heal, connect, and inspire hope. But more than just 3 community nature projects, it's a film about finding common ground, figuratively and literally, through environmental education. On The World We Want, we explore the roots and impacts of changemakers on the front lines of education. People like you building a more caring, vibrant, and sustainable world. And now I'm delighted to welcome 2 of those changemakers, Juliet and James, to the World We Want podcast. I would love to start by saying, why are filmmakers at an environmental conference? It seems kind of like you should be at a, South by Southwest conference or something.
Yeah, well, we're really excited to be here. And the reason we're here is we're presenting a sneak preview of a new film that we're working on that explores kind of this question of how can environmental education be a bridge in a time where we have a lot of fractures and a lot of divides. And, that was kind of the impetus of us, starting this inquiry of the film, which is still very much in progress. But we have uncovered some really compelling reasons why EE, environmental education, is one of the most powerful tools we have at building community, at finding common ground. So we're really thrilled to present a really small sneak peek of what we're working on here, and to open up the conversation and to learn, while we're here amongst so many professionals who work in this space.
Just to add on to what James said, so we are building on a previous film project that we did together that explored similar themes, but it focused on communities in Eastern Oregon, particularly rural communities that were turning to renewable energy to bolster their economies. And one of the things we were exploring in that project was the assumptions about people in rural communities and what they care about, and similarly, assumptions they might have had about people who live in urban places, because there is a real divide in the state of Oregon between kind of the rural red and the blue cities. That's a simplification. And that's one of the things we wanted to show in our work, is that there's a lot more going on when you zoom down to the ground level and start meeting people in these communities and learning about what they care about, including their attachment to land, which is very strong.
I wanted to ask you, where do you both live?
So I live in Southern California, in San Diego.
I live in Southern Oregon in a rural community outside of Ashland. So I feel like I have a rather unique perspective. I've both lived in big cities and small communities and very rural mountain communities.
Right.
So I've kind of seen it all.
Well, one of the strong tenets that, we've discussed with several people on this podcast is a sense of connection to place. If you're going to build a strong love for nature and a love for the environment, you have to have that connection to place.
And of course, another big threat to this connection to place is technology. And I mean, an incredible opportunity with technology, of course, too. But if we're trying to establish a sense of place in a child who's spending 8 hours a day on a screen, it's going to be pretty difficult to do. And so that's something that, we've been thinking a lot about, and we've been, I think, really coming back to, wow, environmental education is really, really important now more than ever, perhaps, because there are so many threats to us as human beings, maintaining this connection to place and an appreciation and understanding of the systems of nature that support us.
So we started with this inquiry, and it had to do with some trends we were noticing in the culture at large. As James mentioned, kids spending increasing amounts of time on screens and social media, spending more time alone and less time with each other, and certainly less time outdoors. This loneliness epidemic that we keep reading about, these mental health crises, along with, of course, the ever-widening social-political divide. All of these trends seemed somehow interconnected, and something that environmental education had something to say about. And so we really wanted to explore that.
One of the driving themes in environmental education today is connecting not just the facts of climate change or the facts of an environment or so many, hectares or acres of rainforest loss or that kind of thing, but it's trying to reconnect people to place. I think we've kind of forgotten that in this push to become urban creatures, and now the whole planet. I mean, I think we're up to now nearly 80% of the planet lives in an urban setting. Over 85% of America lives in an urban setting. And I think there's almost been a natural them and us by that migration. And what the thems in the urban areas have lost is that sense of place. I'm curious how you started conversations when you would go into a place and describe what you were about to do, a film you were wanting to make. What were those first conversations like?
We went back more than once, and that really helped too, to build rapport, making more than one trip. I mean, in an ideal world, we would have made multiple trips to all of these places, but we were working with a budget and on a time crunch. And so we did what we could. But I think those repeated visits told people that we were serious about what we were doing. We weren't just parachuting in, getting what we needed and leaving. We were actually interested in learning more deeply what this was all about and making repeated visits to make sure that we were being authentic in our representation.
We went out a few times into the woods, and sometimes we're recording, other times not, and it was real magical to kind of to build some of that understanding of how folks live, and of course through those conversations and those experiences, reaching a place where we find that commonality, that, oh wow, this is just really beautiful, or this is really cool, or that type of thing. And I think that's the real opportunity in this type of sort of trust building and creating conversation across these perceived divides. You really quickly break through the divide, and it just takes the wind out of those sails when you're in a room, or you're in the woods, or you're sitting around a kitchen table with people. You just start to talk about family and friends and things you're interested in. And, oh, did you hear about this? And it's really beautiful.
And so if there's anything we could do to foster understanding and respect for both urban ways of life and rural ways of life, I think that would be a really good place to start.
And I think that, that kind of speaks to the power of environmental education, because it connects people with with the natural world, with nature. We start to sort of see these systems. We see the sort of change and evolution that happens constantly. It's such a dynamic, world that we live in. And so that perhaps connects us all with a sense of hope and opportunity. Both in the breaking down of the walls that is us, and what we're seeing happening in nature is that we are not separate from that. Perhaps that alone is just a spark of hope that can help us, navigate difficult change.
And there may be some resistance to change, understandably, but I think as these examples show the way, that I think they'll become more common and more embraced.
I'd love to pivot to the new film. That seems like a great place to do that, is connecting to kids.
So we started out with this idea of finding heroes. We wanted to find heroes and environmental educators who were heroes doing really good work in very specific communities. I think we did that, but I think we also did more because what we discovered is that it wasn't just about one person in one community. It was really about this constellation of individuals interacting with each other and with the place. And that's kind of where the magic happened. And so in our working project, we're highlighting three, I'm going to call them programs, but three manifestations of environmental education in different places that look very different from each other, but they have in common this community building, bond building structure that I think is really critical to their success. And it's really about the relationships that are being formed within this particular place, between the individuals and the place, but also amongst the individuals. And I think that's the power of environmental education.
Yeah, and I think, that this all started from a place of similar to Other Side of the Hill, where we just, there's so much disconnect. There's so much sort of fracturing and these narratives of divides. And, is we just sort of curious again, is that reflective of the truth on the ground? And so we intentionally kind of sought communities that sort of represented some of these divides. One of the places that we went in the film is Chicago, specifically South Side of Chicago. This is one of the most disinvested communities in the whole country. We see a lot of divide sort of play out in Chicago. Arguably one of the most segregated cities in the country. A lot of issues around access, and so in the heart of that context, there is just magic happening in this environmental education program called Southside Blooms, much more than an environmental education. It's almost difficult to sort of put it into a box because it is so many amazing things. But I think at its heart, it is sort of providing a framework for community and for healing and for education through nature. And, they sort of convert vacant lots in the south side of Chicago into productive, sustainable flower farms. Kids are learning, how to farm and in the process getting connected to nature and getting connected to each other. We also went to Kentucky, which is a place with a very interesting context when we speak about environment. And we found, first we found an educator, a professor who's working on a really fascinating body of work around, it's titled "What is Political About a Tree?" and sort of doing some research on how do we deliver effective environmental education in a partisan context. That led us to a forest educator, a person who started a forest school in sort of on the border of eastern Kentucky, and so this now is a place of common ground where folks from rural eastern Kentucky come to bring their kids for education alongside folks from more urban Lexington, and of course. You have a context of coal in Kentucky, which is really fascinating, and a very, very sort of complex, nuanced political landscape in Kentucky. And then the last program that we went to was in San Antonio, and this was we profiled an outdoor environmental educator who was connecting children who were part of military families who have suffered loss to the power of the environment and nature to sort of help us through those most difficult moments that we all experience as human beings. And this was happening in the context of the San Antonio Riverwalk, so really wonderful insights there about how nature is everywhere, and it doesn't look one particular way. And I think through all of this storytelling and listening that we've done, it's starting to signal how powerful environmental education is at fostering community and working through these perceived divides, because it is, connecting us to our own nature. And it's doing so in a way that is, I think when it's at its best, it's doing it in a way that's very mindful of place, very mindful of context, for the individuals who are, the sort of students in the context of this education. And I can't help but think kind of in this context of a divided country politically, and we think about democracy and all this. I mean, what an incredible tool at returning us to community. An incredible tool at bringing people together on literal shared common ground, to mingle, to converse, to heal together, to share, so we're enthralled by this film and the subject matter, environmental education. I mean, we're very much in the middle of learning, and I think when we come to a place like this and, NAAE conference, we're coming here similarly to how we approach the other side of the hill, to listen, coming here to maybe pose a question or two, and then to really kind of understand what all of the amazing educators are bringing, to their practice. And help that inform how we kind of finish this film, because of course it's in the middle of post-production right now.
Absolutely. And I just want to stress that we are by no means experts. Neither one of us is an environmental educator, and the programs we're exploring in our film, we don't even know where exactly they fall on the realm of environmental education. I think they certainly are included in that definition, but they may fall outside the traditional bounds of formal environmental education for sure. And we felt it was important to pick examples that maybe were surprising and show the breadth and depth of what connection to nature can look like and maybe should look like, because I feel like one of the important takeaways we've had is that this kind of experience should be happening everywhere. It's just so critical, both for children's healthy physical and mental development, but also for communities to be empowered and healthy and resilient.
It's interesting that you should say this sort of formal concept of environmental education. I think one of the things that we're hearing because of this podcast especially is that umbrella is much bigger than we have all considered. And as with every single voice that comes to this podcast, they're sort of pulling somebody different or a new idea under that umbrella. And I think that might be one of the things that comes out of it, and probably will come out of your film, is that there's a lot of different approaches. I mean, one of the things I'm curious about is, because physically, if you're talking Kentucky, Chicago, San Antonio, you're talking about three very different places on, North American continent. And each of those places also have different immigrant groups that are living there. And they either lived there for a very long time and brought there by whatever means. And they don't have a connection to the rural landscape around where they are. They're definitely urbanites. And I'm curious if you saw in these stories, you saw that sense of culture brought into their connection to nature.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's like being an environmental educator is perhaps being a guide, for folks to connect with the nature and the place wherever they are, sort of the external nature, and that is going to look different. But through that process, we connect to sort of our shared nature. So, the way in which that happens, it looks different in all these different places. It looks different in the communities and the context that it's happening. But I think about the program in Southside Chicago, And, really interesting that Keelan and Hannah are the folks who are running that program. And, they don't describe it as an environmental education program because that might be a barrier to some folks coming in. So it's really framed around opportunity, economic opportunity. You can come work on the farm. You can come work in the flower shop. And of course, that's addressing a really specific, an important need for a lot of the young folks who they're reaching, and that might be different for the program that's happening in Kentucky or San Antonio or wherever in the country or the world it's happening. So yeah, it just kind of brings me back to the real significance of being mindful of context, and ground up environmental education is really seems to be kind of more effective than top-down environmental education.
Related to that point, one of the things I found so interesting about going to these TAPS, the TAPS event in San Antonio, we spoke to several children of military families. We spoke with several mentors who are paired with these kids. And of course, by nature of being in the military, a lot of these families have moved around a lot. And so one of the things we asked them are, how do you connect with your lost loved one? And so many of them talked about experiences that they had shared outside, camping, hunting, fishing, hiking, and so on. And at the same time, several of them described having moved a lot. And so a lot of them are not necessarily living in the same place as they were when they lost their loved one. And so one of the things that Jason Stout, who was leading these healing and nature workshops, was trying to convey to them is that they can draw strength and healing and peace from nature wherever they are, wherever they have access to nature. And I think that's just such an important lesson. I mean, there we were on the San Antonio Riverwalk and they were staying in a conference hotel. And you know what those conference hotels are like. We're in one right now. They're lovely in their own way, but they can feel very disconnected from nature and from the natural world. And so what he was doing was pulling these people out of the conference setting, taking them out to the river walk, which is, yes, a contrived environment, but still beautiful in its own way. And there are lots of natural features. There's trees, there's water, there's birds, and just connecting them and their bodies to the experience of using their senses outside. And I thought that was a really beautiful contrast to some of these more place-based programs that we were experiencing, because you don't always have access to place.
What is the most difficult? So now you're in post and you're looking at this pile of film that you have, all these images. You're trying to make decisions about what to use and what not to use and how to create those stories and weave that together. Couple of questions. First one, what is it you want when you're looking at all of this? What is the story you want to tell that you want people to resonate with people who watch this film?
Well, I think we leaned in hard to the emotion of these stories and of the characters. I mean, I think we want people to viscerally feel the urgency of this project. And when I say project, I mean this project of connecting people to nature and having them understand their place in it all, like their connection to these natural systems and how they have a hand in them. And so I think for that reason, we really leaned on the emotional pull of these characters and of their stories. That for us was top of mind.
Yeah. And I think, theme wise, it's really about community, and it's about the significance of context and also awe and wonder, and how that's a really wonderful vehicle of kind of starting these conversations. But, we recognize that those are things that a lot of folks in the environmental education community are talking about and have been talking about for a long time. So I think what we're hoping to do with this project is to kind of connect that to this present context, and if we kind of simplify it down, it's like we have two sort of choices here. One is continue to lean into this divisiveness, and that, that can look like us all sort of, driving our stakes further into the earth. And so I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right. And that's one path. Another path is really valuing and prioritizing community building. And there's really no better place to do that than in nature. And of course, this is happening in a context where there's a lot of threats to nature. There's a lot of threats to this, this prospect of making sure that kids today and in the future remain connected to the natural world. And so it's in a way a call to action, to environmental educators, continue doing this work. It's incredibly important work. But it's also a call to action, to perhaps a more general audience that, hey, look, this form of education that maybe at times has been viewed as a smaller part of education or kind of just an enrichment program. Actually, this maybe should be central to the way in which we educate people, moving forward, and central in this prospect of, frankly, preserving democracy. So I hope we're kind of moving in that direction. We're in the middle of it. So these are kind of the hopes and dreams. We'll have to chat again once the film's done.
I do have one more thing to add. Something I was curious about is how we would feel, here it is Wednesday after the election, if we would feel differently one way or the other about going forward with our project. And what I'm discovering for myself is that it kind of didn't matter. And the trends that we were exploring, the loneliness epidemic, the social political divide, those would have continued no matter who won. And so I feel like our project feels urgent no matter what. I feel like we really need to figure out a way to go forward and view each other as human beings, get out of our silos and start talking with each other again. And I feel like environmental education provides the literal common ground where those conversations can happen in a way that maybe is going to be more productive.
How do you think what you're doing is best done with film? Why is film the best vehicle to do what you're trying to do?
I think film, documentary film in particular, is a magical medium to capture nuance and complexity, because you're presenting a narrative through audio, you're presenting a narrative visually, and then you're also you're doing it in a way that is very much a participatory exercise with the audience, and they're bringing a whole nother layer of sort of narratives to that film watching experience. And so it's so exciting to work with this medium because there is so much that can be captured and explored in that nuance and in that subtext. I'm most interested in the stories where the lines are sort of blurred, where there isn't a right and wrong per se. The name of our documentary production studio is Synchronous Pictures. And so it's this idea that things can be many things at the same time. And I think documentary filmmaking is a wonderful way to sort of explore ideas and stories through that lens.
It's about as an immersive medium as you can get without maybe going out in the forest. It's kind of second best. But yeah, you have music, you have the visuals, you have the nuance of human action and expression. And yeah, I just think it's probably the most powerful medium we have.
It's coming into the edit, like moving from pre-production to production to post-production is such an interesting process, because you start, especially with a documentary, you start pre-production with this sort of, you're kind of vision questing, you're putting together these paper edits and scripts of kind of what you expect you might get. And then, of course, you go out into the field and you discover many things that are very different than what you expected to happen. And then you come into post-production and you start watching interviews and watching, verite scenes you've captured, and it takes on a whole nother life because of, I think, what you were just describing, Juliet, with the nuance of expression. And of course, most of the communication is happening non-verbally. And so it's really a beautiful process and also very challenging. And it's challenging because it's hard to put it all in a box. And I think that reflects one of the main challenges of this film too, is that environmental education is really something that is pretty tough to put into a box. But of course, there's value in doing that and sort of, making things easy to talk about or providing frameworks that are sort of easy for us to understand quickly. But it's really wonderful when we can kind of break through the limitations of these categories and these boxes and connect to something a little bit deeper.
Thank you both. Juliet, James, thanks. We, on the associated materials and out in the social media stuff, we'll put some links to the other film, and then hopefully soon the new film. Folks can take a look at it. But thank you so much for taking all the time to do this.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for having us.
Through documentaries like In Our Nature, we discover film can personalize global issues, such as climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. It not only informs, but it moves people towards action. What James and Juliet remind us is that environmental education isn't just about outcomes and program deliverables. It's about relationships, with place, with each other, and with the possibility of a shared future. In Our Nature is a powerful call to listen more deeply, build more bridges, and recognize the quiet work happening in communities across the country. You can learn more about the film and the work you can do in your own community by visiting our website at NAAEE.org/podcast. I'd like to add a special thanks to our entire podcast team, Carrie Albright, Judy Browse, Jimena Cuenca, and Stacy Pierpoint for making this podcast possible. And a special thanks to you for being a part of the world we want. I'm your host, Jerry Ellis. Join us next time to hear more stories of individuals and communities creating a better future through the power of environmental education. You've been listening to The World We Want, the NAAEE podcast.